My name is Kemi Oyewole. I am a PhD student here at Stanford, and I am excited, as in my role as graduate fellow in the Otero Public Service House, to help bring this event to Stanford. So one of the goals of the Public Service House and Stanford more broadly, hopefully, is to advance disability justice, or at least accessibility on Stanford's side. I think we are pressing for more disability justice, and that's what we're excited to have Imani speak on this evening. And I wanted to introduce our wonderful interpreters, Debbie and Shanice. So they'll be helping us here today. And with that, thanks to the Hyperion Neighborhood that helped fund this event. And now I will pass it on to one of our amazing student leaders in Otero and the ASSU. I was like, okay, what does that stand for? It was like Associated Students of Stanford University, Director of Physical and Mental Health, Sophie Shev. Sophie Shev. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share space with you guys. As Kemi said, my name is Sophie Shev, and I am the Director of Mental Health and Wellbeing at the ASSU here at Stanford and a proud Otero resident. And I'm so excited to be welcoming our incredible guest, Imani. So I'm going to share a little bit about her. Imani Barbarin is a disability rights and inclusion activist and speaker who uses her voice and social media platforms to create conversations engaging the disability community. Born with cerebral palsy, Imani often writes and uses her platform to speak from the perspective of a Black disabled woman. In the last few years, she has created over a dozen trending hashtags that allow disabled folk the opportunity to have their perspectives heard while forcing the world to take notice. Hashtag patients are not faking, hashtag things disabled people know, and hashtag, my favorite, ableds are weird. And others each provide a window into disabled life while forming community. Imani is from the Philadelphia area and holds a master's in global communications from the American University in Paris, and her published works include those in Forbes, Rewire, Healthline, Bitch Media, and more. And she runs the blog crutchesandspice.com and a podcast of the same name. And to share a little bit about my personal inspiration that I draw from Imani, she has truly been a guiding light for me and has rooted me in the principles of disability justice as I have navigated what it's like to attend an institution that is actively participating in ableist and eugenicist projects as a disabled student. Her work has made me feel so seen and safe in my experiences and reminded me that I am accountable to a community of radical disabled activists fighting for us to be able to engage in the systems of communal care and joy that have sustained us throughout history, but are threatened every single day by ableist forces. I am so honored to be in her presence after so many years of learning from her. It feels like years, but really since the middle of the pandemic when I discovered her TikTok page. This is a super duper full circle for me moment for me, and I feel so honored to be in her presence.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. I have a mic. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate you all asking me to speak with you this evening. I hope everybody's doing well and munching away. I will never begrudge a college student free food. I still like free food. Not many people give it to me, though. So, but again, thank you all for having me here. As discussed, my name is Imani Barbarin. I go by Crutches and Spice online, and I often talk about my disability as well as disability inclusion. And today's topic is going to be talking about disability and race and its intersections. One of the things I always start off with, so we all have a baseline. So just so we all have a baseline, is the definition of a disability. Does anybody know it? Okay, that's okay. We got it. So according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, to be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability, which is defined by the ADA as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment or a person who is perceived by others. I paused there for a reason. As having such an impairment. What sticks out to people about that definition, or what is missing? A list. You know how every single time we talk about disability, there's always some non-disabled person or somebody who's uneducated about disability that will say, well, that's not qualified as a disability. Did you hear one? Did you hear a singular disability? No. That's for a reason. When we think about disability, we have to think about the definition as being expansive, constantly growing and contracting based off of new illnesses, disabilities, post-viral issues, things like that. There's also the barriers to diagnosis: race, gender, sexuality, economic class. May all be things that bar people from getting a diagnosis in the first place. Additionally, I want you to pay attention to the very last part. So I'm going to read it again, okay? A person who is perceived by others is having a disability. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but when you apply for a disability as a person in the United States, you're allowed to use somebody else's testimony of you to diagnose you with a disability if you don't have access to regular diagnostic care. There's a reason for that. That's a good thing. But what's the downside to having the idea of disability as being perceived by others? It could be easily weaponized and has been historically. When we think about disability, we think of it as its own category. But disability is like water. It seeps into everything. It goes everywhere. There's not a singular demographic that will not have some experience with disability. However, who experiences disability and how varies based off of their own identities. As of right now, or at least prior to the pandemic, we do not have an accurate updated count, but about 27% of the US population has a disability. That's massive. That's a massive amount of people. That's nearly 60 million people with a disability in the United States, according to census data. A massive amount. And when we think about disability in the ways it has been weaponized, we can never think of disability as apolitical. Disability is always political. In fact, we often hear about disability without ever mentioning the word. It's one of the easiest ways to dehumanize people. It's one of the easiest ways to isolate people and shut people out of conversations. Disability is political and cultural through the lens of white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. Can we think about some of the historical ways disability has been weaponized against different communities? Or the very least systems of ableism? What about queerness being seen as a mental illness? Who knows what drapetomania is? You know? Yeah, it was the disease of the enslaved person wanting to run away. Freedom. Wanting freedom as an enslaved person was considered a mental illness. Has anybody heard of protest psychosis? Around the anti-war movement, they began institutionalizing and putting particularly Black men in mental hospitals who were protesting, who were movement leaders, grassroots organizers. Because protest doesn't just happen like that. There must be a psychosis going around. Right? And with that institutionalization, they performed unconsensual psychosurgery on those people, lobotomizing them. What about the history of institutionalizing women? Hysterical. hysteria. That is also a part of our history, particularly women who were sexually liberated, politically liberated, and did not kowtow to the patriarchal society. They were oftentimes put in institutions, nursing homes, state-run mental hospitals, again, lobotomized, experimented on, and assaulted in many ways. We have people being chemically castrated in the 50s and 60s for being queer, particularly queer men. People who do not fit the norm have always been put into the medical system. And it's easy to do. What happens once we declare somebody as mentally incompetent? Somebody else takes over. Somebody else intervenes for their best interest. Somebody walks over into their lives and takes control. And we have entire systems and frameworks for how to do this. And to this day, this is something that happens. When we think about disabling factors, groups who have been historically marginalized have some of the highest rates of disability in the country, if not globally. Because discrimination and lack of access is disabling in and of itself. Excuse me. 2 in 5 trans adults have a disability. 1 in 4 LGBT adults have a disability. 3 in 10 Indigenous people have a disability. 1 in 4 Black people. 1 in 5 white people. 1 in 6 Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. 1 in 6 Hispanic. And 1 in 10 Asian people have a disability. Now, please bear in mind that the numbers I'm giving you are likely to be considered undercounts. But we'll get to why in a second. Okay. And then additionally, 1 in 4 women have a disability. So when we think about the rates of disability and how it wears itself in the bodies of those most marginalized, it exhibits the highest rates. And structures are designed to disable. If you live to this day in a neighborhood that has been historically redlined, you are more likely to have asthma, respiratory illnesses. That is baked in to American society. And because ableism is not just a United States thing, it's global, you can likely find that marginalized people in every single society likely have the highest rates of disability. I would bet money on that. Not a lot, because I don't have a lot. But I would bet money on that. Disability is the continuation, most of the time, of genocide, of racism, of apartheid. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that for every person killed in Palestine, 3 will be disabled. That's on purpose. You don't leave when you're disabled. Most countries have ordinances and policies barring disabled people from immigration. It is a crabs in the barrel issue, and it is designed that way. Even moving state to state here can be nearly impossible, especially when needing to get resources, to be closer to family. This is what disability looks like. When we think about the imperialism and disability and genocide, we have to think about how systems are designed to interact with us as a population. There's a picture, I don't know if you all remember it, because I'm old. But I don't know if you remember this picture, but there's a young man playing with a train. He's a Hispanic man. He appears to be autistic, and he's playing with a train in the middle of the street. And his caregiver, a Black man, lays in the street in front of him because a cop is pointing a gun at him. And the Black man is in the street with his hands raised like this, signifying to police he does not have a weapon. They still shot the Black man. Neither of them were armed. The young man with the disability had a toy train, and that was it. 30 to 50% of people killed by police have a disability. Our systems are designed to interact with us like we are combative at all times. I have cerebral palsy. It is well known among police and policing that with my particular disability, I always walk like I look drunk. And I always happened to be driving a car because I'm not walking. Sorry, not doing it. But it frightens me every single day passing by a cop, fearing getting pulled over and a cop thinking that I am drunk simply because of my disability. There are multiple stories of disabled people, regardless of race. I wanted to make that clear, regardless of race, being shot and killed by police for either looking combative or appearing drunk or intoxicated, when that is not the case. There's a video just went viral on TikTok of a police officer attempting to yank a paraplegic man out of his own car. And when people told him that he couldn't walk, he said, well, you shouldn't drive then. And the system is designed so we have to interact with these systems at all times. In my state of Pennsylvania, if you need an accessible placard, the two people that can sign off on an accessible placard are a doctor or the police. When we think about disability and we think about how systems work its way onto our bodies, this is some of the things that I'm talking about. And when we think about disablement and imperialism, it is done on purpose. In the Congo, there are impromptu amputations to embarrass resistance fighters, to disable them, to make it harder for them to migrate and move out of the danger zone. When we think of the mental load that is genocide, that is a disabling factor. And it is designed that way in almost every single country. There's always a disabling factor to the oppressive systems that exist no matter where you are. Whether there be roads that make sure that you cannot go to the doctor, or a lack of access to doctors that actually listen to you. In 2023, just 2023, the National Institutes of Health deemed disabled people a marginalized group in healthcare settings. In 2023, that's way too late. We've known that. And that's a compounding factor, particularly when you consider Black people in medical settings, women in medical settings, queer people in medical settings. Disability, like I said, seeps into everything. It makes itself known in the ways that culture interacts with disability. And a lot of the times, marginalized groups themselves take part in othering disabled people because of how history has worn itself on their bodies. I used to work for a disability advocacy agency in Pennsylvania. I worked for what's called a protection advocacy agency. I have to do a little bit of a plug though, because I want to make sure you know that this is a resource that you can use for your entire lives if you have a disability. So every single state has one. They advocate for disabled people to make sure that they are getting their accommodations at work, at school, at businesses, things like that. But one of the hardest parts about my job was getting resources to marginalized people, to getting resources to Black people or Latinx people. Why? Because those cultures in particular know that claiming disability is a liability in a lot of ways. And that's the tension we have to deal with, is it not? You have to get people to the resources for disability without making them feel disabled for doing so. That's a conundrum, is it not? Quite often, my methodology was to make sure people never felt like they had to claim an identity to disability. And that's a contradiction in my life. I'm very proud to be a disabled person. I have no problem with it. Not how people feel about my disability is not about me, it's about them. But for other people, I know for a fact that there's tons of people that are not there. There are tons of people who remember, and who are older people who remember how disabled people have been treated and are very fearful of being labeled under that same umbrella because they don't want to be further marginalized. They don't have more work to do to advocate for themselves at every turn. I understand that. But I always went into it with the idea of get them to the resources first. Don't make anybody claim any identity that they don't want, but make sure that it is known that these resources are available to them. And even still, even with that tactic in the back of my head, people still refuse. People are still afraid. And sometimes people will participate in othering systems and biases. What's really interesting about ableism and disability, let me go over ableism. Ableism is the preference for non-disabled bodies and minds. And anybody can experience ableism because anybody can experience disability, but also anybody can experience disability being weaponized, right? So it's interesting when you think about how we hear, that we listen to homophobia, right? Does anybody think about the ways in which homophobia is expressed? Oh, they're sick. They're out of their minds. It's crazy, right? It's always expressed through language of disability. Another example is that joke. I hate this joke. How many fill in the blanks does it take to screw in a light bulb? That's a joke about intellect, about intelligence, which is always linked to disability. That's the joke. That's the punchline. And so people particularly who are much older than us, I say us in a very hopeful way, but I do recognize we are two separate generations. But older people, especially when we think about disability, remember that. Disability integration into society is brand spanking new. It's less than 30 years old. It's over 30, but it's as old as I am. The ADA was passed in 1990. I was born in March. It was passed in June. My parents had me without any assurances about the ways in which I would be able to navigate the world around me. My parents had no idea about disability law, particularly as young Black people. My mom was 27 when she had me. Don't tell her I told you that because she knows you can do math. She lied about my age so much she forgot how old I was for like a good 3 years. My mom had me when she was 27. My dad was 33. They had no idea how to navigate disability systems. It was only in 1974 that the United States government promised to fully integrate disabled people into society. Prior to that, we'd been warehousing disabled people. Those institutions where queer people went, where gay people went, where protest psychosis patients went, they were the same institutions housing disabled people. That's where we lived. From the 1860s until the last ordinance was struck down in 1974, it was illegal in many places for disabled people to be in the public because we were disturbing. I'll disturb you, all right. But it was disturbing to the general population for disabled people to be out in public. And when you think about the statistics of disability, what does that look like? What do those institutions look like? Geraldo Rivera, when he did journalism at one point, I don't know what he does now. A little bit of something, I don't know. But when he did journalism, he did a report on this facility in Pennsylvania called Willowbrook. Is anyone familiar about that report? So I don't know if they went undercover or they went just spontaneously, but in the 70s, they took cameras into state-run institutions and found disabled people of all colors, but they found disabled people in facilities on the floor in their own filth. There were people that had been chained to beds. There were people that had been locked away for so long, they'd lost the ability to speak or use language. There were disabled people moaning in pain, that their pain was not taken care of. And the report embarrassed the United States government so much that they promised to close institutions permanently and they integrate disabled people into society. That is where we get the term home and community-based services, is from there, from that reporting. Multiple other reports came out as well, showing the exact same thing. And people were so incensed that it really painted the government in a horrific light. And they wanted to start closing those institutions and started doing so actually very quickly. But what wound up happening is when you don't explain to communities where there's a flood of disabled people into the neighborhoods all of a sudden, well, those are drug addicts, right? And so the policing system began to pick up disabled people that have been put into communities without many supports, because they really hadn't thought out the process about how to integrate disabled people into society. And to this day, we actually still have institutions in the US. Those same institutions that we were shown 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they still exist in the United States today. When I was working for that same agency, it was announced that we were going to help facilitate closing 2 state institutions. And you know who was the angriest about it? The family members. The family members didn't want them in their homes. Their own relatives were the biggest advocates to keep these places open because we don't fully fund home and community-based services. It would cost $400 billion to fully fund the services we need as disabled people, but we don't. Given the beginning of the talk that we know about, and I just gave you, is there any wonder why we don't fully fund those things? Why we don't fully fund community in this country, particularly when it comes to disabled people? Disability in this country and around the world is often like a system of segregation. We are taught how to move about the world. Our rights are very easily taken from us. We have systems of conservatorships and guardianships meant to strip us of our rights. And as much as we are treated like children, and as much as disabled people are told that everybody else knows better, we still fight to live in society. Some of our biggest advocates around disability, despite communities often being reticent or reluctant to talk about disability, have been groups like the Black Panther Party, who started the One Community School, and who actually were some of the very first and foremost architects of special education and individualized education. Or the Black Women's Health Project, who went around to churches and nail salons and hair salons and created groups of Black women and gave them the language to talk about disability and illness. And I'm sure there are many others of groups that may not always use the language of disability, but have always been doing the disability justice work. When I think about disability justice, I think about full integration into society. But not just that, excuse me, also the capacity for disabled people to lead in movements, for them not to be judged based off of arbitrary ideas around intelligence or capacity, but for disabled people to be able to speak truth to what our existence actually looks like and to build communities that support us. When we think about disability justice, it will touch every single movement that we care about, because disability touches every single demographic, every single one. We need it now more than ever. The pandemic has shown us exactly which systems are failing, and were designed to fail. That's the part we don't talk about. They were designed that way, designed to fail. When the pandemic started, our office were getting medical rationing guidelines. A lot of people think of the pandemic as like, I baked bread. I now have sourdough starter. Nobody will teach me how to make that myself. But anyways, I learned how to knit and crochet for the first time. Our office is looking over some of the most heinous and discriminatory policies in regards to hospitalization of disabled people. They were telling our office that if facilities were full, they wouldn't treat disabled people. And particularly in the West, we have like a very self-aggrandizing idea around our capacity to care for people, or just our capacity to do anything really. And all of this showed that no, we don't have it at all. I believe it was Sweden. Sweden was one of the countries that our leaders hailed as one of the examples for COVID control and COVID mitigation. They were giving disabled people morphine instead of treating them and not telling them, because their hospitals were at capacity. This is the case for many westernized countries, industrialized countries, particularly countries with universal health care. And when we think about the demographics of people who are disabled, the people who are most marginalized, that's devastating knowledge to have, is it not? How easily disabled people are thrown by the wayside, knowing who we are. I encourage everybody to think about disability in the ways in which it touches things you don't think it touches, and the ways disability shows up in systems, not just your everyday life. I want you to think about how systems work and how they are designed to enable this type of behavior towards our community. Oftentimes people think they see me talk about disability or my disability and think I'm just talking about it, or hope to talk about it, on an individual level. No. This is baked into American society as much as racism, sexism, homophobia, any ism you can think of. And it is one, particularly in progressive spaces, I often see used as a backdoor for all the bigotry people say they're against. You can't be pro-Black Lives Matter, but ableist. You can't be for a free Palestine and ableist. You cannot be for queer liberation and ableist. Because if you know the history, you're doing a disservice to your own work. And that's why when we think about movement work, when we think about disability justice, it has to start with you. This is going to get a little personal. Some people may be in their feelings. Just let it happen. That sounded weird. It'll be okay. I promise it'll be okay, okay? Some of the greatest signs we have that we have ableist thought processes are not in how we treat others, but how we treat ourselves. I know, it's getting uncomfortable. I'm so sorry. It's in how we treat ourselves. It's in how we decide exactly how to care for our own bodies and minds. Much of the ways in which we think about ableism or ways we treat other people is just projection. How many believe laziness is a real thing? Good for you, right? When we think about rest, especially, that's where it rears its kind of like really ugly head. When we think about how we want our bodies to accept rest, a lot of people will fight it. I fight it. I'm a champ. I got my black belt in fighting rest. But oftentimes we're fearful of looking lazy. We're fearful of not performing ability because that is what is always required of us. When we think about little things in our lives, like doing the dishes or putting things away or whatever, we'll do it standing, even though our back hurts. We'll overwork ourselves, knowing full well we don't have any energy left. Disability and learning anti-ableism starts with you. It starts with how you treat yourself. Additionally, it also starts with you unlearning what you think capacity is. There are so many times at work where I had to check myself quite often because we worked with a lot of disabled people who had intellectual and developmental disabilities. As somebody who was raised with my disability, well, that trauma will come out next summer. But I was often, because I was high achieving academically, held up against other disabled people. Imani can do it. Why can't you do it? Or Imani, she's actually trying to not have a disabled mindset. What about you? And I remember feeling icky about it, but being told, that is the goal. The goal is to be somebody who is always aiming for normalcy or ability. But it really took working and actually working with disabled people and letting other disabled people lead that I had to check my own biases against who has the capacity to lead, who can run a conversation, who can advocate for themselves. There's an entire movement in disability advocacy specifically for intellectual disabilities called self-advocacy, where they are teaching one another how to advocate for themselves and to set goals for themselves, and to not simply rely on non-disabled people to speak for them, but for them to speak for themselves. That is not something I grew up with. I had a Black mom. My mom would drag me to my own IEP meetings and doctor's meetings and say, what do you want to say? Well, how do you want to lead this? And watching as other people check their privilege with me. Like, well, don't I talk to you? My mom's petty. My mom's very petty. She likes to mess with people. Also, she's also a little bit rude. So we would go, for instance, we go to the grocery store and somebody would come up to her and be like, oh my God, you are such a good mom. And I'd be standing there, mind you, 15 years old. Not need to be talked to like a toddler, but they would only talk to my mom. And my mom would go And then they would make the connection, oh, you need to talk to Imani directly. She would literally just stand there and be like, and it would take people a minute to decide to talk to me. But that is how we are socialized to do that from this big, to always discount what disabled people are saying, even if we are disabled ourselves. Even if we know how ableism interacts with our everyday society, we still do it. Ableism is so baked into our society, you will find disabled people be some of the most ableist people. And that includes some of us. So, when we are talking about disability and integration into society, I want you to ask yourself at all times, how does disability play a role? How does disability play a role in the advocacy I'm doing? Because not all of you here are here just talking about disability. How many of you are in other groups? Look at you with your extracurriculars. That is so fun. I rescheduled myself too. But when we talk about disability integration into society and understanding how it works, you will find the ways in which disability impacts things. You'll find how disabled people are already working on what you're working on. You need to find those avenues and connect with people. Find the disabled people who are already working on those things. Because I can guarantee you that at every turn, there are. And I want you to read more about disability. So there's some books. Do you want to know a list that I want you to walk away with? Alrighty. A Disability History of the United States. First and foremost. Very good book. Always necessary. I'll give you all a second. Because I will write quickly. I will not write legibly. And I know some of you are like that too. So, A Disability History of the U.S. Feminist Queer Crip by Allison Kafer. Kafer. K-F-E-R, I believe. Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. Yep. And Black Disability Politics by Dr. Sammy Schock. Full disclosure, I do voice the audiobook. Okay. So those are a good primer on disability and race and identity. I think they're all important to start formulating ideas and understanding histories of not just disability identity, but activism as well. Can I say this? We fuck shit up. Disability advocacy and protest has always been a part of our culture. From the BART protests where disabled people laid in front of the bus systems so not a single one could go for weeks, to the 504 sit-ins, which you all know about from Crib Camp, to pissing off Mitch McConnell outside his office in 2017. There's a very famous picture of an activist handcuffed behind her wheelchair. It's a badass photo. If you ever want a poster of it. Just saying. I know you all have Canva. But I want to round this out by saying, whatever you're doing, whenever you're doing it, I want you to ask yourself, where's the disability angle? How does it interact with the work I am doing? And how can I better integrate disabled people into my advocacy? Advocacy is a lifelong process. It is draining, it is tiring, it is never ending. God, I wish it would end. But because of that, you're going to need to rely on one another. You're going to need to form community amongst one another. And you're going to need to learn from your own biases and build space for other people that you may not have imagined before could fit into those spaces. It's about combating privilege, understanding what it looks like, but also weaponizing it to advocate for other people. Disability will be a part of all of our lives at one point or another. We represent the fourth of the population. We are underrepresented, we are overlooked, and we are often silenced and killed. It doesn't have to be that way, though. And as dire as things feel right now, as frightening as things feel right now, there's always hope in community. There's always joy in community. So while you're here, I hope you don't just find my words, but one another's words comforting and helpful. And that you build upon this space that is created here to connect with one another. This is school. You live in like a 1 mile radius of one another for like 4 years. That rarely, if ever, happens any other time of your life. Take advantage of it. Build with the people while you're here. And build accessibility for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many great things are bubbling in my mind as a result of those comments that touched on so many points in the history of the United States, in global history. I'm sure we all will have those thoughts throughout. But if you do have a question that you would love to voice to Imani right now, we have an opportunity to do so, both in person and for our folks online. You can send them by chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Imani, for being here. I have a small plug and a question. The plug is there's a conference this weekend, a virtual conference, Stanford Medical Alliance for Disability, Inclusion, and Equity, that's being held. If folks are interested, you can just go to our website and register. It's free, virtual this weekend. The question is, I'm a physician. We do not do well by people with disabilities in my profession, not just in terms of patients, but also in terms of our colleagues. We do not accommodate almost anything. It's a very ableist profession. So for me and anyone else who's a physician in the audience, maybe on Zoom or in this room, what is like one thing you would like us to be doing differently, either as individual physicians or as a profession that you'd like to see from us?
I think, and I always say this about the medical field, I think the most important thing to recognize is, as a physician, is that for us, nothing stays in that room. Every single thing that you diagnose us with, every single note that you write down, every single thing you do in that room is something we have to carry with us for our lives. And this may be a very unpopular thing to say, but when is it not? But I think I feel about physicians and like the medical field and particularly representation in the medical field, the same way I feel about like policing in a lot of ways. Because there are many instances in which you go to a physician's office or you go to the hospital or the emergency room, and you may not leave. Like not even just in a like very life or death type of way, but you may be going to a nursing home, an institution, a mental health facility, and you may not leave. And I think there are so many doctors in particular that don't recognize that our lives don't, like, your interaction with us doesn't just end there for us. It can carry into so many other aspects to our lives. And so just a recognition of the power that you all hold is probably the most important thing. Because I feel like it's kind of just taken as like a lackadaisical thing. Whereas I went to a hospital once, didn't go home for 3 months, and I wasn't allowed to go home until I could prove that I had an accessible home. So yeah, I just want more physicians to recognize the institutional power that they hold, and use that more to advocate for patients rather than institutionalize patients.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was so moving. Yeah, like I said earlier, I originally found you on TikTok, and something that I've been thinking a lot about as someone that's kind of grouped into this world of like mental health advocacy and therefore constantly being told the issue is young people are spending too much time on their screens, is how much more of an accessible community for advocacy social media has created for content creators like you. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about how disabled creators and activists are particularly vulnerable to a lot of kind of like that crackdown and shutdown that's happening around politics online, kind of like that censorship.
Well, I think when you mean like political censorship or like governmental or more like the interpersonal type?
Both. I'm speaking specifically like about how I think it's meta. So like both Instagram and like Facebook now, like you can't see political content unless you say like, show me political content. But a lot of times the people that become most censored are those whose identities are politicized, which you spoke about. Disability is a very, very politicized identity. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that particular vulnerability and maybe how it's impacted you or the community of activists that you're part of.
Oh, sure. So interestingly enough, Meta kind of has always had some inkling of that policy. So if you look at Meta's monetization policies, they'll say you can't talk about disability unless it's positive. Now, Zuck. But when it comes to the crackdown and the censorship of political content, it does impact disabled people. I think we actually have a little bit of a privilege, though, that I don't think a lot of people recognize, which is, and this may sound terrible, but it does work. But oftentimes, if I'm smiling and cutesy talking about horrible things, people don't know that I'm talking about political content. It's particularly when I'm showing like a mobility aid, people often infantilize us so much that they often want to go for like the inspiring story, and then you just punch them. But it is really impactful. It does really impact a lot of disabled people, that people are shying away from political content. The disability community online, particularly on Twitter, started with like Crip the Vote and those types of movements that really kind of presented disabled people as a demographic, like I was saying earlier, to be campaigned to, that the politicians should be interacting with. And I think in America, we have this very toxically positive desire to always want to be happy. Especially with people who like would turn on that political filter. But realistically, I think the people who want that content will always find a way to engage with it. And that's why I kind of diversify my content as well. I don't always talk about disability. I talk about communication. I talk about pissing people off in like other ways. But yeah, I think it is a very frightening time, particularly with censorship and our government in particular wanting to censor people's voices. But this has always been the case with anti-war movements as well as intersectional movements. There's always been a pushback on people speaking about it. So you just have to, I feel like in a lot of ways, you have to get more creative, or be louder, or to be like more community based and oriented, and make sure that we do things in lockstep with one another rather than one person doing things here and one person doing things there. More collaboration, and more community based advocacy as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Earlier in your talk, you talked about how like looking inside yourself as a way to break down ableism. Mm-hmm. And so like, for example, I experience like severe chronic pain. So I would like that to stop, because to me that like hurts. Right. But sometimes it's hard for me to draw the line between wanting to just like be normal and like trying to think about like not feeling bad. Like it's hard for me to figure out which things are parts of my disability are because the world is not accommodating me and which things are just like my body hurts.
Right.
And so do you have any ideas, or like, I don't know if this question exactly has an exact question or more of just like a vibe, but like
I vibe.
how do you like draw the line between like perpetuating ableism and wanting like a cure for yourself and also at once realizing the fact that like being in pain sucks, right? Like,
right, of course, yeah. I think for me, the question usually is, what is a reaction to what my body is doing, and what is something that I'm repeating to myself that somebody else said to me, right? Because of course you don't want to be in pain. Pain is pain, you know. But if you're, say for instance, you were in pain and somebody said to you, well, you know, everybody's in pain a little bit, like you could just work around it. That's not something that is a reaction to your pain from you. You see the difference? If you're saying to yourself, I don't want to be in pain, I'm in so much pain right now, like I wish for this to stop, that's not ableist to say. That's you. That's a genuine reaction you're having to your body being in pain. Oftentimes, especially when it comes to like labor and laboring, those are the thoughts that are usually the ones that go internal, right? About working through the pain, about ignoring the pain, about overcoming it. You know, those types of that type of language, not necessarily something you're genuinely reacting to. So that's kind of how I differentiate it, if that helps at all.
Thank you so much, Imani. I've learned so much from you today. I wondered if you could speak more about neurodivergence and how it intersects with disability. As more neurotypes are becoming, like there's more awareness about autism and ADHD in social media. And I also think like for my experience, like being a disabled person who like learned more about my disability because of the stressors of academia. I think that might be helpful maybe for like the audience who is in a very like high pressure cooker institution.
So just to clarify real quick, just to clarify your question, are you asking me to talk about what specifically about neurodiversity? Because we can go off on a tangent. You got it. I have ADHD too. You got to give me a lane.
Yeah, I have ADHD too, so I don't know all the lanes, but I guess to specify, more so about like, how do you honor your diagnosis and its limitations, right? While still like recognizing that like, you know, autism and ADHD are neurotypes, so they're not necessarily like a reflection completely of something wrong with you, but rather like a neurotype that doesn't align with what society normalizes, right?
I think with neurodiversity and neurotypicality, I think that when we think about how our brains work, because it's so internal, people think of it more as personality. Does that make sense? We often think whenever we're interacting with how somebody else's brain works, it usually manifests in how they embody it. Does that make sense? And with neurodiversity, it really is brain chemistry. It is really just the way your brain is interacting with space and time. And I find that when it comes to learning about your neurodiversity and learning about how your brain works differently, it's almost kind of like you have to separate out moments in time to understand how your disability is interacting with that moment, right? It's always really interesting in hindsight to look back on our life experiences and think to ourselves, oh, that's why I'm like that, you know, and not really put blame on ourselves. But I think with any disability, really, there's this kind of instinct to internalize that disability has shaped who we are, and it has. I think when we try, like, how do I put this? That's a complicated ass question. I think it's okay, but it's complicated. I think that separating ableism, like our internalized ableism, from like our natural reaction to our disability is one thing, but disability does shape us, and it's okay to have shaped us, right? I think we badly want to tell the non-disabled people in our lives, or the neurotypical people in our lives, you know, barred from this is how I am. You know, if I didn't have this is who I am as a person. But you're only the person you are today because of how you have navigated your disability, because of how you've interacted with the world with your disability. And I think that's okay. I don't know who I'd be without my cerebral palsy or ADHD or diabetes or sleep apnea, or like, there's a list. It's ever expanding. But I don't know who I'd be without it. And I'm really reluctant to tell people, particularly young disabled people, that that your disability doesn't shape you, because it's okay that it does. It's okay. It's okay you don't want to be in pain. It's okay that you have ADHD. It's okay if you have autism. It's okay. That is no value. That's a negative value to you. And so I'm always like really, really careful not to try to separate the disability from the person, because some of us wouldn't be who we are without it. And I'm sorry, it may not be a satisfactory answer, but I want to be careful to make sure that you know it's okay. It's okay to be who you are with your disability. It's okay for it to have informed how you've interacted with the world. It's okay for it to shape your anger responses, your the way you are sad in some ways, the way different things make you happy, because it's always been there. Like, there's no moment in your life where you could like pluck yourself out of it, pluck just the purest version of you out of it. We're all informed by our experiences, and that's okay.
We have a question from our Zoom friends. This from Lily. I'm a medical student with disabilities. I'm wondering if you can speak to advocating for your rights and those of others in work environments that are extremely hostile to your needs, when, for example, your paycheck or career success might be on the line. Yeah. I hope that's not an experience you've had, but I imagine it might have been, or you might have some thoughts to share and would love some tips.
Yeah, I mean, at least for my younger jobs, they were more afraid of my mom than me. She shows up a lot of places. When it comes to academia or jobs or things like that, oftentimes, I was talking about this earlier at lunch, when we get to spaces that are deemed like filters through society, people do not expect disabled people in those spaces, simply because they think the barrier to entry has already filtered out disabled people, right? So, like I said, that's academia, that's the medical profession, that's tons of different jobs. Even like if you're stocking shelves or a cashier, they'll say you must lift 30 pounds, even if that may be necessary to the job or not. When it comes to advocating for yourself, though, I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Put everything in writing. If I hear that they called you, write an email following up. If they say, oh, I just want to have a little, I just want to have a little meeting, a little heart-to-heart in person, follow it up in an email. You want to think of your job as, in advocating for yourself, as documenting every little thing. Every little thing. And they will try to play those little tricks on you where, like I said, they will do have a phone call, or they'll meet in person, or they'll make sure there isn't a record. Have a record. Make sure you have a record that is also not just on their servers. So not just through your work email, not just through your school email. Email it to yourself. Email it to yourself too. I don't care what their policy says. Email it to yourself. Print out a copy. have a physical record. And understand too, you can hem and haw, you can go back and forth all they want to. At the end of the day, it's the law. At the end of the day, it is the law to accommodate you, not some wish, not some charity. It's the law, and they have to follow the law. They have to make sure that they are following the law. Now, certain professions like the medical field often will say, well, if you can't do this, like this is a requirement for the job, they have to do A, B, or C. Treat them like an insurance company would treat you. Well, have you tried every treatment? Have you tried everything? It doesn't sound like that's the policy. It doesn't sound like that's what I want to do. Step therapy them, right? If your insurance company is going to make you try every little thing under the sun, you make them try every little thing under the sun. And also, you need to press upon people too that accessibility is a trial and error process. Only about 20% of people are born with their disabilities in the disability community. That means 80% of disabled people are disabled as they age, right? That means that they are, a lot of times, only in adulthood interacting with accessibility and accessibility tools for the first time. That's trial and error. Not everything's going to work for everybody. And they need to be patient as you try to figure things out. That's why we step therapy them, right? Because it's not going to be a one answer or one size fits all. Because oftentimes they have like a list of things that they provide and then they don't do anything else. Accessibility is an imaginative process. But again, make sure everything is in writing.
And I just wanted to add in response to that, in workplaces, reminding all of us to help each other, help our peers. We'll often see someone who may not have interacted with disability before experience it, and really asking us all as folks connected to Stanford or in the broader community to see if someone else needs that guidance when they don't know how to advocate for themselves, so we can really be in community that way.
Yeah, and also that protection advocacy agency that I told you about before, especially in California, that place is huge. So if you need backup for advocacy, you can call them.
Just to clarify, what is this agency called?
So the reason why I say protection advocacy is because you can Google protection advocacy agency plus your state, because you may not always stay here. And it'll bring that up. But for California, it's Disability Rights California.
Awesome. I was wondering if you could expand on what you've done in the past when it comes to accommodations, arguing that they are reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've had a lot of experiences of like places being willing to accommodate, but the line stops at whatever they consider reasonable.
Mm-hmm. That's when I just call my mom, to be honest. No. When it comes to reasonable accommodations, that's why I impress upon people too, that like it is an imaginative process. Like you have to go above and beyond just the little sheet that they have of what they offer. In terms of unreasonableness, right? I guess arguing whether they want. This is the hard part. Is arguing, like, do they not want you in the class? I would put it on them, to be honest. Do you not want me here? Are we deciding not to accommodate me because I'm asking for something that you are unfamiliar with or knowledgeable about? You really want to strike at the ego, to be honest. Like, this is more of a communication thing than anything else. You want to strike at, particularly in academic spaces where they deem themselves knowledgeable and, how do I put this? Not ignorant, cocky, right? They're cocky in their intelligence. So you want to hit them with the insecurity of them not being intelligent. Oh, you don't know about that? You're not like really well read on that? That's a shame. That came out like a decade ago. You're not even, okay. Hi. Yeah, you can get them shamed by their own boss. They go above their heads. Bring in other students to advocate too, that this is something that is reasonable. And also contact the university, contact the news. Ego goes a long way. Contact whoever you need to. Make an embarrassment of them. At the end of the day, the goal is to get you what you need. So don't hesitate to pull out all the punches. Okay. Also, with unreasonableness, I think there also needs to be more responsibility on the university's part to have like an accessibility library, to do more classes on what accessibility looks like. I always use this as an example. I don't know if you've ever heard of the TikTok account Tech Owl. No, so Tech Owl is out of Temple University in Pennsylvania, and they're basically an accessibility library and also workshop, and they basically teach not only the university about accessibility and what it looks like, but students, organizations, and if more universities had things like that, I feel like it would be less anomalous for them to interact with new accessibility all the time. Because again, accessibility is an intimate process, but it's also an imaginative process. And we don't ever give space for it to be those things. People think, especially non-disabled people, think of it as like 1 or 2 or 3 accommodations that they've known for all of time. And then they go about their day. But again, go above people's heads, go to the press, and embarrass them. Use their ego against them.
We have another online question from Reynaldo. What do you think is the reason why disability advocacy is almost not mentioned in mainstream policy discussions in Congress and the media?
Well, like I was saying before, I think disability conversations are often deemed childish or seen as like a bunch of people whining about things that are handed to them. We have a very constricted view of what disability, first of all, looks like, and second of all, what disabled people are actually doing with advocacy, right? And the media in particular does not like to run disability stories unless they're inspirational. I mean, that was the policy Meta literally enforces. They don't ever interact with disability unless it's inspirational or cute or so sweet. Jesus Christ. But that's not what disability looks like. And I think, too, when we think about systems, they know who makes up the disability community, like overall. And this is kind of like their back door to a lot of the ways in which they can enact violence on other communities, right? So I hope it wouldn't be that, but a lot of times it is that. It is that our politicians and our news really only have one method and one avenue towards interacting with disabled people, and that very rarely includes actually listening to disabled people ourselves. And we often hear a lot of discussions couched in things like healthcare or like Anderson Cooper has like a real disdain for the disabled community. I don't know if you've ever like looked into it. He runs a story at least like once a quarter on how a disabled person asking for accommodations at a local business is like anti-small business, you know? So we hear about those stories too. And a lot of times it ends with a call to overturn the ADA. Yeah, you really don't like us. But yeah, like, so I think that like when we hear about those things, those are the stories that we hear the most. But I don't think people ever really discuss disability in terms of even intersectionality in leftist spaces. Disability is often left out regardless of where you are. And I think it's only recently that because of the pandemic that disability has even been discussed at all. And that's because people realized their lives are determined by what disabled people get. Because the whole pandemic was just non-disabled people living like disabled people. And they literally couldn't handle it. They were climbing the walls, right? So that's kind of why I think, and then eugenics runs deep, right? It runs deep in the society, runs deep in our culture, and it has very much so reared itself, both during and post pandemic.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. A number of things resonated with me today, and you tied them together with such a beautiful narrative. One thing that particularly stood out is when you encouraged all of us who are in this space, but also in other spaces, to engage with disability in those spaces as well. Mm-hmm. That's something that I find myself doing in literally every space I'm in. It gets very tiring. I'm a grad student in computer science. Right now, I'm trying to get people in that community to think critically about artificial intelligence, its connection to eugenics, those sorts of things. And I often get the reaction that those sorts of questions are too niche or too unusual, unimportant to ask and answer. And sometimes that reaction is like, you can do it, but you're not going to get any actual support in this area. Mm-hmm. And so I guess speaking like very generally, how does one avoid burning out when they feel like they always have to be the one asking the questions? And also at the same time, being constantly positioned as the one that can answer questions on this topic, when, at least for me, I have exactly one experience with disability, as does any other individual, and I can't speak for everyone.
Right. Well, first of all, when somebody asked me something similar to this earlier, I'm the worst person to ask when it comes to boundaries. But what I will say is that you don't have to always ask the question. I think that oftentimes we think of advocacy, and I think that social media really has done a disservice to young disability advocates as well. When disability is not just a part of your advocacy, it's a part of your identity, you never get a break, which means that at some point, the person who has to say, I'm not going to ask this, is you. Right? And that's not to say that the question isn't important. That doesn't mean that like the topic isn't important or doesn't need to come up, right? It just means that sometimes you're exhausted and you can't fight every battle, because you have to not just advocate. You're not just advocating for your community or this line of thinking in your work. You're advocating for yourself every day too. I actually had to leave my job because I was doing disability advocacy online through my website at my job in person every day for a year. And then when the pandemic came down and I saw the medical rationing guidelines, and it like I got so burnt out I couldn't function anymore. And at some point you have to say no to yourself too. Sometimes advocating means advocating against yourself as well, and saying to yourself, like, I've done enough for today. I can't do this for today. And even saying no to people's questions. You don't have to answer people's questions. You don't. And like, it's unpopular to say in a group full of disability advocates, right? But at the end of the day, you're the one that has to like find the energy to climb into bed and go to bed at the end of the day and be okay. And you can, and if this is your everyday life at all times, all the time, there's no coming back from a burnout so bad that you're trembling and like can't speak anymore. Right? So sometimes when you advocate, you have to advocate for yourself against yourself. Because the life you lead, right? You can't burn out like that. Because what is left for the people? First of all, what's left for you, right? What's left for the groups in which you're advocating? What's left What part of you is left after that? It's the same thing I say to people who are interacting with disability for the first time. You're breaking yourself down. You also have to give yourself time for restoration as well. And I know that when we think about self-care, like everybody has like decoupled it from Audre Lorde and talk about bubble baths and just get on Netflix and chill. Well, that's not really, anyways, but you know what I mean? You get what I'm saying? We think of it as like this very commercialized idea, and sometimes it just means setting a boundary even with yourself, to say no to things, to not always do the thing. And that's not a satisfying answer, particularly for somebody who is passionate about it, but you won't have anything left. I promise you, if you keep going at the rate that you're going. Okay?
Well, we're almost wrapping up. So were there any other questions online? Okay, so we're going to get these last 2 questions and then see or last 3 questions, and then we'll see what Imani sort of comes up with to tie it together, give us insights.
Okay. Thank you again. I know that I am someone who experiences the privilege of like not being disabled myself, but when I tell people that like this is issue and advocacy that I'm really passionate about, I get oh, that's so inspirational. Oh, like you're the voice for the voiceless. And it's so hard. I can't even imagine like how hard it is as a disabled person to hear stuff like that, especially when you are just advocating for you. And like you said, that is just your life and your experiences, and you never get a break from that. So I know that's like a frustration that I deal with, and like it's even exacerbated for actual disabled people. And so kind of talking from Vioma's question from earlier, just kind of I know that as someone who's non-disabled, my goal is to make sure that the first thing I tell people is to listen, read, uplift actual disabled voices. When I share resources that I have, they're always directly like from disabled people. But I also know that having all of that weight and that burden should not just be on disabled people themselves. And so I guess my question is, how do you balance, or how would I balance as someone who is not disabled, like wanting to be a good ally and a good advocate, but not wanting to overstep any boundaries? Because I know that's like a lifelong teeter-totter that I've been trying to deal with for as long as I can remember. So
I think the most important thing is to just listen. I think a lot of people think I have to be the one to speak first, I have to be the one to have to say anything or do something. When in reality, a lot of times disabled people just want somebody to listen to their experiences and give and just say, yeah, that fucking sucks. You know, like it's not fun all the time. And I think taking a step back and letting disabled people lead in those moments and ask where you can be supportive, because it's hard too, because there's it's going to be different for every individual, how they want you to interact with their disability and how they want you to help accommodate them and advocate for them. But it really starts with the listening process and asking people, how do I show up for you in a way that is honoring you as a person? And I think with allies, I think you're in a better place than most, because you recognize that people can position you in a way that, like, voice for the voiceless and as kind of an intermediary to interact with disabled people. I think you're already on the right path. You know, I don't have to talk you down from, you know, talking for other disabled people. I don't have to tell you to, you know, maybe not, you know, call the news station for a disabled person. It's like, nah, I just want you to be here and advocate. And also, a lot of times, bearing witness is incredibly important too, especially when you know, like you were saying, you were advocating with, I guess, a higher up that doesn't take your needs seriously. Being somebody's like, oh, I'm watching you, right? Being another set of eyes that can say, like, hey, I'm watching what you're doing. I'm watching you interact with this person, and I will be their witness for when they decide to either take you to court, you know, like things like that, or need backup if you want to go to the press or go to higher ups. Like, I'm going to be there. bearing witness and being there. And this is the same thing I tell people who want to advocate for others in medical settings too. Sometimes it just requires that you bear witness, that you're in the room, that there's somebody else, another body in the room that they have to be accountable to, right? So that it does matter when you do things like that.
Hi, I had a question. So I know in this talk we've heard a lot from you about how to advocate for yourself to make sure your needs are being met, like in the workplace, in the classroom, etc. And I was curious how you go about having your needs met when it comes to like interpersonal relationships, like love, like dating, friendships, and how you navigate that both with fellow disabled and non-disabled people, like your emotional needs as well.
That's a tough question. I think with interpersonal relationships, it hasn't always been easy. I think that like I stay away a lot. I've stayed away for like most of my life from developing too many interpersonal relationships because I don't feel like I don't want to have to advocate in them. But I think what I've learned over the years is that there's an intimacy that comes with knowing somebody as a disabled person. Not just knowing somebody, like to be loved or to be known, that type of thing. I mean, like there is genuinely an intimacy to having your needs anticipated, as well as anticipating other people's needs and accommodations, and just knowing how they interact with the world because of their disability. And I think that we often view, at least when disabled people are in a relationship, either with a non-disabled person or another disabled person, we view interacting with their disability as an extra, as like, oh, well, because especially when we have like an online dating culture or hookup culture, especially when we're interacting with those types of things, we have a tendency, particularly as disabled people, to get it all out of the way, but it'll never be out of the way. To like dump on somebody and be like, hey, I have this disability, I have this accommodation. If you can't deal with this, I can't, and that serves its purpose. So we're not dealing with assholes. But at the same time, learning and growing with somebody is key to any relationship. And that includes your disability. That includes even sometimes taking advice, and I know this sounds terrible, from a non-disabled person because there's credence to somebody looking in and saying, I think there's an easier way for you to do that. And I think that those moments are always super special when you're thinking about interacting with in friendship or in love, somebody knowing you so well that they can fit in the puzzle piece and say, maybe I can help. Like, maybe I can give you a different perspective, or this person did this thing, it was pretty shitty. And I think it's really hard, though. It's really hard to be vulnerable in that way, because this is like the epitome of vulnerabilities, the way that our body works, right? The way that our mind works, letting somebody in on that and letting somebody see that for all that it is, good and bad, right? And I think it takes, you have to be vulnerable. And you have to be okay with being vulnerable. You have to get okay with letting people know you, not just know the version of you that is easy to get along with or easy to accommodate, but getting to know a version of you that struggles too, and that doesn't have all the answers about your disability and is also still trying to figure it out. Because as we age, our disabilities change too. But yeah, I think that like you have to be vulnerable with people. You have to let people in, and that can't promise that it'll always work out, but it's a great privilege to be able to have that interaction with somebody and it fully feel like somebody completely knows you.
What a beautiful note to end on, this reminder to find love, to enjoy vulnerability. And we also had this reminder to rest and to remember that it's not a one-time process, right? It's not like you unlearn ableism and you got your A+, you got your degree in it. It's an ongoing process and unlearning, learning new things. And I'm so grateful that we had a chance to learn so much today from Imani. Let's give another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I urge you to continue looking out for these amazing resources. DISCO, our Disability Community Space. If you haven't checked that out, supported that, get involved there. We have this great event from Stanford Medicine coming up this weekend. Check out their website. Think about other, again, intersectional ways to engage. The Stanford Powwow, largest student-run powwow in the United States, is coming up on Mother's Day weekend. Think about ways you can get engaged, show up for that, and be in solidarity with all oppressed peoples, especially as we think about what's going on in Palestine and ways that we could support the folks who are going through a lot there and the ways that disability manifests itself as a product of war and of violence. So thank you all so much for beginning this work. If you are in person, Imani will be here for a little bit longer if you want to chat with her one-on-one. But again, thank you and have a good night. Oh, and also get the rest of the food. Take some burritos with you. Get them for your roommates, those things. Yes.
The Stanford Powwow has a specific committee dedicated to accessibility. So if you are worried about your ability to attend the event, we can accommodate you. We are a student-run committee, but yeah, we have the, labor in place to accommodate people if you need it. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.